Universities play a critical role in supporting and addressing the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. A key aspect of this role is fostering understanding of and engagement with the goals. The world is becoming increasingly urbanised and the population constantly growing. Today, more than half of us live in cities, placing them at the forefront of some of our biggest challenges, from public health to climate change. Goal 11 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Sustainable Cities and Communities, is focused on addressing these complex issues. As part of the UN's Blueprint for a Better Future, this goal aims to make cities inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. To help me unpack this, I'm joined by Professor Cheryl Desher from Griffith School of Engineering and Built Environment and Professor Paul Burton, Director of our Cities Research Institute. Welcome, Paul and Cheryl. Paul, do you want to start off by telling us what's SDG 11 all about?
Well, so it's about making cities inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. So it's pretty wide-ranging and pretty ambitious, especially given that most of the world's population now lives in cities or other settlements. So we're living in places that the SDG 11 and its components apply to. So it's pretty broad-ranging. I'm a town planner by background, and in a sense, none of this is new to us. We've been pursuing, we didn't call them Sustainable Development Goals or Millennium Goals, but we've been pursuing that kind of agenda for maybe 150 years. Not necessarily with great success, but you know, we're on that journey, and this gives us an extra fillip, a bit of a boost, which is welcome.
And Cheryl, we say cities, we could be talking modern megacities with millions, tens of millions of people. We could be talking about areas with large slum populations, cities that have existed for hundreds of years. It's a really wide variety. So how do we get our head around a universal goal that applies to such diverse environments?
It's a toughie, and we're all on the same planet, very small planet hanging in a really quite a vast amount of nothingness. So when we look in from space and see planet Earth, talking about cities gives us a frame of reference. So it's a way of us being able to bring together ideas and apply them. And the context of cities then could be any of those that you just talked about. The opportunity for resilience involves cities working together around the planet. There are 195 countries around the world. I had to look that one up, 195, and all but two are actual active member states of the United Nations. So inside that organising, I'm an engineer, so inside that organisation then we've got really amazing ways to make a difference in a logical, planned organisation. Yeah.
And if the world was a bit more organised and planned, that would be great. As Paul says, we've been trying to
planner and an engineer
do this for a long time. We're not necessarily doing so well on things like green spaces, public transport or sensible transport or so forth. What do we need to be doing differently to get better results?
I mean, just following up on what Cheryl was saying, I think that the challenge with the goals is to downscale them to particular places, because the principles are fine at a global scale, but when you downscale them and apply them in your setting, that's when you have to recognise that it'll be a bit different. So what we need, what's appropriate and needed in Brisbane is not the same as Beirut or Da Nang or Mumbai. So in terms of green space, I'd have to say that actually in where we are, the major cities, Brisbane, the Gold Coast, we don't have a problem with green space. I mean, half of the footprint of the Gold Coast, where I mainly work, is not built upon, and it probably won't be. Brisbane is a very green city, so we're actually quite good on that front. Could we make our green space better? Absolutely. Could we value it a bit more highly and a bit more systematically, putting an economic value on it? Because we know that green spaces in all their forms, they deliver what we call ecosystem services. So they clean the air, they cool the environment, they help us capture water. And when we put an economic value on it, then maybe we're in a better position to stop it being converted unnecessarily into a built environment. On the transport front, again, we sometimes say, oh, the congestion is really bad. I got stuck for 10 minutes on the M1. I mean, again, you try to get from one side of Jakarta to the other, or commute from the suburbs to central Moscow, and it's a different order of congestion. So actually here in terms of public transport provision. Again, it could be better, but you know, we've got Cross River Rail on the books, we've got the Brisbane Metro on the Gold Coast, we've got the Gold Coast Light Rail. They're the start of what will become really good systems. So we're pretty well endowed here, but that doesn't mean that in other parts of the world, in other cities, they've got some serious challenges that we simply don't have here. So we're very fortunate.
It's a mindset thing too, isn't it, Paul? I think as we deal with those localised place-based solutions for green space, for example, or transit-activated corridors where you might have smaller nodes of development where people can still get to what they need and be surrounded by green space, being able to do that actually shifts our mindset into much larger scale challenges around climate change adaptation in where cities are positioned, how they relate to their periphery, whether it be the beach or the mountains or grasslands. When we do it at a local scale and get success from that, I think it really helps us as human beings know that we can make a difference at scale. So,
I mean, the other thing I'd just say is that you're absolutely right about mindset. The biggest mindset I think that we have to change, and we are changing it slowly but surely in Australia, is our preoccupation with and commitment to owning and driving petrol-fueled vehicles. You know, I mean, it's a relatively recent phenomenon, but we're absolutely wedded to it, and it's almost like, you know, our most significant human right is the right to own a vehicle, to drive on a congestion-free road, to park for nothing wherever we want to go, and that's got to change.
It's funny
because it's utterly unsustainable.
We didn't even have fridges until mid-last century, and yet we think that it's just something that is in our everyday. And David Suzuki talks about us being in the most unbelievable bubble of abnormality this century.
Yes.
And if we look to the past, things like the boulevards in Europe provided amazing examples of where people could come and be together in environments that had a backdrop or a stage
Yes.
of nature and get their well-being needs met, and then apply that to the beautiful art and explosion of science and art in that era. And yet
Yes.
today we have our fridge and we have our car and we
Yes.
think this is the best there is. Yeah.
Although there's also, some of these were places designed very much for a middle and upper class to have their
Absolutely.
enjoyment, while they outsourced a lot of the misery
Yes.
into really parts of their cities or their countries that were less.
Well, the French in particular, you know, the rich said, we're going to stay in the centre and make it nice, and we're going to push the poor to the fringes, to the banlieue.
and that story didn't end so well.
Well, we
no.
still have that, don't we, at the three large areas around the planet that we have 1 billion people still living in abject poverty in slums. And they're quite close, often adjacent to the really amazing cities that are espousing green space and opportunities for doing well by doing good.
Yes.
So I think there's, in that organisation of things, as an engineer, I think that there's opportunities even in places that are very close together to learn from neighbours, where the climate is the same, geography is largely the same. It's just that the human population's experience is really different.
And Cheryl, you do a lot of work on emergencies, and as Paul said, many of us live in cities now, and again, that's a relatively recent phenomenon. And emergencies impact on cities a bit differently to the way they might impact on other environments. We've all been living through that globally with COVID. What have we learned from COVID? How could we apply that to other situations and thinking about resilient cities in the future?
It's a really good question, Carolyn. When we're dealing with disasters or emergencies, and we have the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, and that's been really helpful internationally through the UN and other mechanisms to help us understand what we can do in an emergency and how we can recover. We talk about preventing, preparing, and then responding and recovering, and that's a cycle that we're in. The past is full of stories of acute times of that, where we've been able to recover enough and feel good and then face the next disaster oncoming. The difference with COVID is that we've had this chronic and global experience of the same disaster, and that has resulted over the last couple of years in a very deep sense of fatigue amongst our decision makers, amongst our population, people dealing with isolation and confinement, and then dealing with a lot of bereavement and grief. That overlay on emergency management is quite new in its scale. And I think moving forward with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and 11 in particular, requires us to deal with well-being and that context of resilience in recovering in the face of ongoing adversity. And that's a really different situation. But we can get inspiration from nature. So my research area of study is biomimicry, so it's innovation inspired by nature. You know, nature does that all the time. Nature is full of ongoing diversity every single day. And critters like the prairie dogs, when they are faced in, every day is a challenge for them, they have a leader, stands on a little hill, and when they see indicators of disaster, they alert. And the rest of the pack stops enjoying themselves and runs or does whatever they're pre-programmed to do. To have that kind of either automatic, whether it be sensors, or human-based in terms of leadership, letting us know when we really do need to be worried and act, and then allowing us to enjoy our lifestyles that we remember and we would want to return to in a way that meets the planet's needs. Greenhouse gas emissions for travel are a little unsettling in terms of looking ahead. Can we do relaxation without travelling as much and have those prairie dog-like instincts of group culture is, I think, a really key consideration in going forward with the SDGs.
It's a great example. And in that broader ecosystem, of course, one of the players often universities. Paul, is there a role for universities in cities? Well, I hope there is.
Please say there is.
What is that role?
Absolutely. On three counts. Firstly, in the education and the training, professional development that we provide. Certainly in our areas of, say, planning, architecture, civil engineering, construction management, things like that, that's absolutely critical. Then in terms of the research that we do, and that research of course feeds into and informs our teaching, which is good, but also informs, we hope, policy and practice. But a third area which I think is sometimes a bit underappreciated, but I've always thought is absolutely critical, is for an engaged university, is to make our spaces, and we've got some fantastic spaces and we invest big money creating fantastic spaces, that we can then bring people here to have informed and thoughtful conversations, perhaps in contrast to the kind of shouty conversations, well, they're not even conversations, the dialogue that's had on social media. We can bring people together to address those issues, to be confronted with alternatives, but in a respectful and a thoughtful and a kind of an academic way. And if we are willing and able to do that, and we've got the facilities to do that, then I think that's a great supplement and a complement to our teaching and our research.
The opportunity there too, Paul, I think, is to remember that universities are enabled by the public and the taxpayers' money, and in doing the university machinery of day-to-day for teaching and learning, we also have an opportunity to be a civic university in being there for decision makers and leaders. So, being a place for a retreat and to be able to do that deep thinking supported by the academics providing the evidence base, really critical. And then to be able to do scenarios and planning ahead in a place away from the office. So, you've got your talent and your facilities working together. For me, in terms of emergency management, that actually lends itself also to disaster response. Universities often have quite large campuses. Sometimes they're in the city and out of the city. Being able to go somewhere as a physical retreat to then be able to have mindful response that enables our decision makers, I think is a really critical role that universities can play.
And we can model and demonstrate good practice, in what we build and how we run our buildings and manage our operations as well. So, because otherwise, if we're bringing people in and saying, let's have a conversation about living more sustainably, but it's evident from our environment that we're not, then that's a problem. So,
we are.
But I think we're good, and our commitment to the SDGs is an excellent demonstration of living what we're practicing, what we're preaching.
And so, final question for each of you: if you could do one thing differently that would make our cities better, what would your priority be, Paul?
Well, actually, I think it builds on what I've just said. It's actually about creating structures that allow a diverse range of people with different views and different priorities legitimately held, to come together and have conversations about the futures that they want to see and want to create, and the futures that they're worried about and want to avoid. Because when it comes to, as a planner, too often it's at the very end of the process. You get a notice that your neighbour is proposing to do something, you say, I don't like the sound of that, I'm going to go and protest and complain. In a sense, it's too late then. We should have had the conversations earlier when we were having a discussion about the South East Queensland Regional Plan. It's difficult to get people out of their living rooms to talk about something like that. It's easier to get them out when it's, you know, I've got a proposal to put a car wrecker's yard on your next door neighbour's lot. So bringing people together to provide a foundation to talk about our futures, I think that's the foundation that we need.
Thank you. Cheryl. I'm going to be an engineer, Paul. I'm going to say, as an engineer and as a human being, I think at the source of transformation for our cities is energy, and it's the conversation around energy. When I talk to my kids about why we rely on a power station hundreds of kilometres away to generate energy from coal that's really quite inefficient, and then string it to the cities on these tiny poles with wires that are subject to flooding and fire problems, they look at me and say that's a really silly solution, Mummy. Why don't they do something else? So having distributed energy systems with microgrids peppered around the place that are all backing each other up in that looking after your neighbour thought space, that is run on renewables, it has the smarts of our digital technology. Isn't it a fabulous coincidence that as we deal with the impacts of our humanity over the last 200 years with the impacts of climate change, we are also blessed with the innovation and technology that we have been able to do along the same time frame. Our ability to do digital twins, which means basically modelling a city on a computer, to then be able to simulate and model scenarios to work out what the best opportunity is before we build it. That's going to save us, I think, in terms of the short time frame that we have between now and mid-century to get things adjusted appropriately to stop that increase in
And going
temperature.
back to what we were saying about variation, I mean, you can go and see distributed energy grids and networks working effectively in some of the poorest areas in Dhaka in Bangladesh now. So we can learn. It's not to think that we've got all the answers and they can learn from us. We can learn. They're doing it, and they've been doing it for some time.
They're doing it, and they've got their mobile phone, and they're monitoring what they're using, and they're managing it.
Yeah.
And that measuring and monitoring is so critical for us to do at a city scale. So that would be being able to have our energy system transformed so that we can still get around in our cars that might be alternatively powered and use things like trackless trams and other technology that's not so imposing on the landscape. To do that, I think will give our kids hope that we can get things right, and we can do that within the next decade, I've no doubt.
Well, it's great to finish on a note of hope. So Cheryl Desher and Paul Burton, thank you very much for taking time today to discuss Sustainable Development Goal number 11.